Well, good evening everyone, and welcome to our last meeting of 2025. I'm delighted that our speaker this evening is one of our fellow club members, Dr. Kristian Kerr. Kristian will be known to many of you, but let me briefly introduce her. Kristian is a graduate of the Universities of Oxford and Chicago, having studied classics and English language and literature. Her PhD was on the rise of the novel, literary bestsellers, and 18th and 19th century review culture. Kristian has worked in publishing with the Edinburgh-based publisher Birlinn and with Edinburgh University Press. She's currently Head of Marketing and Communications at Calton, a financial planning and investment management firm here in Edinburgh. Her topic this evening, Scott and the Classics. Kristian.
Thanks so much, Madeline, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to see so many people here, familiar faces, and friends and family. So I'm just going to get started. This is an enormous topic, and what I'm hoping is that amongst the multitude here tonight, there will be a discussion of all the things I don't mention in this talk, because when the subject is as vast as Scott and his classical knowledge, or the field of classical culture in the early 19th century, late 18th, early 19th century, the topics are endless, the field is vast. So if you have a particular acorn that you would like to share with everyone, please do so. I'll try and mediate, but I would really love for us to talk to each other as well. Oh. Yes, please just take a slide. We actually haven't started yet, so come into the body of the church. Seems to be only working in reverse. There we go. Okay. I want to start with this image, familiar as it will be to members of the club and to everyone who has a ticket tonight. This is a photo by Lee Simpson of a collection of 9 miniature reproductions of the Chantry bust. And then these miniatures are manufactured by Stoke-on-Trent potter W.H. Goss, who gave his name to Goss ware. And they've been arranged to show the many faces of Walter Scott in light and shadow. They're just 5.5 inches tall, each of them, which is a testament to late 19th century manufacture and the proliferation and circulation of Scott's image in an increasingly massive commodity culture. At first, I looked at this and I thought it was Photoshop, or perish the thought, even maybe AI. But I was delighted to discover that it's not, that these are individual artworks. And I've become rather fascinated by how the expressions differ across the array. But by way of introduction, I'd like to look more closely at the Chantry bust itself. Its marmoreal classicism gives a visual example of the main theme of what I want to say about Scott, and indeed the classics tonight. Sir Francis Chantry was London's most celebrated Regency portrait sculptor. He was commissioned for public statuary, the statues of George IV in Trafalgar Square, and just up the road in George Street are his. He was commissioned for private funerary monuments and numerous busts. In Scott's case, however, Chantry asked Scott's permission to take his likeness, deeming Scott a worthy subject in his own right. The admiration between sculptor and subject was mutual. In 1818, Scott had written about the bust of Robert Dundas of Arniston, that Chantry's work was, quote, as like the original subjects as marble can be to flesh and blood. And after Scott's own plaster bust was created in 1820, Scott wrote to his wife in a letter with characteristic modesty, Chantry's bust is one of the finest things he ever did. It is quite the fashion to go to see it. There's for you. Chantry's studio records that 5 marble replicas of the plaster bust were commissioned. And these were commissioned by individuals, often fairly prestigious ones, and subjects of Chantry in their own right, so Duke of Wellington and Peel also. But the very first marble bust that was made was presented to Scott at Abbotsford in 1828. Scott sat for Chantry once again, actually in that year, in 1828, 20 years after the original sitting. And Chantry wrote, when he sent the resulting bust, that the expression is more serious and the marks of age more than 8 years deeper in that later bust than in the original, owing to Scott's failing health and the shock of the crash in those intervening years. The majority of Chantry's busts depict public figures wearing togas or classical military tunics. For instance, these guys. These clavicle-bearing portraits of Duke of Wellington and George IV. This was actually the bust from which his portrait likeness was taken for pretty much the rest of his reign. But in this, he's wearing a field marshal's outfit. All of this to say, very classical. However, as many of you will know already, the Scott bust provides a rather wonderful twist on this convention. Instead of classical drapery, Scott is wearing a tartan, or at least checkered shawl, pinned with a brooch. The bust has been tartanized. From a distance, the bust looks smooth and generally classical, but on closer inspection, it is detailed and particular to the Wizard of the North. Such was the popularity of this image that it proliferated and circulated in many forms. It's significant that reproductions of the bust, whether in 3 dimensions or just 2 on paper, choose to emphasize the tartanry more or less, depending on the positioning. You could have your Scott more classical or more vernacular, as you wished, or as suited your purpose. So in these engravings, you can see 2 different versions, both produced posthumously in the 1830s for different publications. The tartan is emphasized here for an album of celebrity portraits, Knight's Gallery of Portraits, and de-emphasized over here on the left in the frontispiece to John Gibson Lockhart's biography, The Life of Scott. It's no surprise that such an unabashed work of literary canonization and memorialization by such an ardent classicist as John Gibson Lockhart would choose the smoother classical lines. So in this, we see an important aspect of how literature in the 19th century conceives and frames itself. Classical signs serve as a framing device, even if what's inside the frame by the 19th century has come to have little to do with ancient conventions or subject matter. This is a period in which English or British literature establishes itself as a tradition in its own right, with the consequence that classical symbols come to signify the merely literary, so it becomes detached from that classical reference, signifying mere literariness, as that relationship to ancient cultures becomes less specific. This is especially the case during the coextensive periods characterized by the rise of the novel, broadly 1750 to 1850. That's quite a sort of late interpretation of that, and the Romantic period. So both the rise of the novel and Romanticism have been seen in their broadest strokes as anti-classical. Here are some of the reasons for that. The novel itself as a genre is anti-classical. It has no classical antecedent. It is voluminous rather than lapidary. It deals with low subjects. It is the product of the age of mass production. It is a petty commodity and horror of horrors. It is written and read by women. Romanticism, again in the broadest strokes, is vernacular. It is concerned with native traditions and speech. It is concerned with the individual, with imagination, and with nature rather than society. Of course, these characterizations are generalizations of the worst kind. They are at once true and not the whole truth. First, culture during the Romantic period really is quite concerned, nay, even preoccupied with the classics. And second, the novel as a genre performs a neat takeover of what the classical tradition used to do for literature in its rise to legitimacy. I'm going to say that again. So the novel as a genre performs a takeover of the classical tradition as it rises to legitimacy. What I mean by that is that in the end, the novel fulfills the function that reading the classics once did. So when you might previously have been tutors in how to read classical texts, now reading is largely about novels. And of course it took 2 centuries to get there, but we are firmly there, I think, by the middle of the 20th century and into the 21st. As we heard in last month's talk to the Scott Club, Scott's personal tastes in reading, collecting, writing, publishing, and scholarly activity run away from, rather than towards, the classics. As Natalie Harries showed us, Scott would always enthusiastically pursue a native tale or scholarly mystery, the report of a goblin, rather than a satyr, for example. But I'd like to look again at this letter, which we all saw last month, because it's also where I began thinking about Scott and the classics many years ago, and it pops up in her presentation a little bit like a long-lost friend. So to begin with the context, Scott here is writing to his friend William Berwick, who's an Irish clergyman. He's just published, Berwick, not Scott, a translation of a Greek text, Philostratus's life of the 1st to 2nd century Pythagorean mystic Apollonius of Tyana. No one needs to remember this. Although Byron requested a copy of this be sent to him by John Murray. And he said, please send me the life of the magician Apollonius. So it's actually more Scottish than classical. Anyway, in a situation that is completely reminiscent of modern publishing, Berwick has given Scott notice that his book is coming out, and he's hoping that Scott will think well of it. Scott is apologising for, so Scott's letter is an apology for not having laid eyes on Berwick's book, and the most part of the letter is his excuse for that. Again, a situation very familiar in the world of books. First, Scott's first excuse, valid one, his children have been ill. So actually 3 out of his 4 children have been ill with fever, causing great alarm in the household. But secondly, and this is where he really takes flight, he says he's not a very good judge of the classics. One of the things that's funny to me about this, having spent nearly a decade working in publishing, specifically as the person who writes to an author such as Scott to request a review or endorsement, is that I really recognise this type of letter. It's got sincere regret, and it's got a lot of hyperbole. And it really rings true here. I think Scott protests rather too much. Yeah, and he also, it turns out that he hasn't bought a copy, he didn't ever buy a copy of this book. There is not one in Abbotsford, although there is a copy of a 17th century translation of the same text in the library. But it's likely to have come from the Lockhart family, which again, no surprise. Just finally, in a section that's not up here, he concludes the letter really winsomely by saying, by basically atoning for his neglect of Berwick's books by saying, don't worry, you can have a complete set of mine. And so he sends him, Marmion, and then says, lay of the last minstrel, lady of the lake are to come. Okay, but to turn our attention to Scott's disavowal of classicism here. Ooh, am I too close to that? Okay. He ascribes his disavowal of classicism to a wayward tendency too much indulged in his education. I was too much permitted to study what I liked and when I liked, which was very little and very seldom. To mend the matter, I stuffed my brains with all the reading that was never read. This foreshadows, in 1810, Scott's description of the desultory education of his hero Edward Waverley and his swingeing judgment on him for that reading, in which Scott says, the earlier literature of the northern nations did not escape the study of one who read, rather to awaken the imagination, rather than to benefit the understanding. And yet, knowing much that is known but to few, Edward Waverley might justly be described as ignorant, since he knew little of what adds dignity to a man. Since he knew little of what adds dignity to a man and qualifies him to support and adorn an elevated situation in society. I'll return to the language of class, masculinity, and utility again presently, but let's focus for now on the northern nations and the habit of reading for imagination rather than understanding. With real rhetorical flourish, Scott describes the contents of his memory. Where there should be a Roman patera, lo, there is a witch's cauldron. I am more apt to pray to Thor or Woden than Jupiter. Think of the fairies oftener than the dryads, and of Bannockburn and Flodden more than Marathon and Pharsalia. This exclamation, followed by what's actually a tricolon of comparisons, but it's not quite a crescendo, it makes a point-for-point substitution. A point-for-point substitution of items drawn from classical and Northern European archaeology, mythology, and history. So while Scott is performing some wry shamefacedness about his predilections in terms of his reading, and certainly that cauldron and the fairies are much more lustrous and appealing than the shards of a Roman mixing bowl and the dryads. He's also making a point about the equivalence of classical and Northern European anthropology. So about the equivalence of classical culture and Northern European culture through an anthropological gaze. One of the consequences of Enlightenment conjectural history was that it showed how different societies progressed through the stages of history at different times in different places. This had a levelling effect. Non-classical cultures could be viewed and studied as interesting in their own right, while simultaneously the classical cultures lost some of their particular prestige as they became integrated with and then submerged in a broad theory of societal development. This recalibration of the status of classical culture opens up a space for the formation of new disciplines of academic study in the later 19th century, especially widening the humanities to include the study of modern history and non-classical literatures. The gradual displacement of classical antiquity from a position of cultural supremacy really begins in this moment, and it has continued steadily to the present. Over the course of the 19th century, the classics became more normal, whereas previously they had been sort of normative, they became normalized because they became readily available in English, but also because they just became another discipline, another subject amongst many. As a footnote, I'd also like to add that the historical novel plays a significant part in popularising classical subjects and making them available for mass consumption. The novels that follow Scott in the 19th century, such as Edward Bulwer Lytton's The Last Days of Pompeii, to Sienkiewicz's Quo Vadis, come to mind. And there's no accident that these novels were all heavily indebted to Scott. But Scott is only at the beginning of this transformation in the early 19th century, and classics, that is, classical knowledge and a facility with Greek and Latin, was still at this time considered a normative social discourse for gentlemen, and it was one that Scott upheld. He wrote to his son Charles in these terms, which are striking in their imagery. A perfect knowledge of the classical languages has been fixed upon, and not without good reason, as the mark of a well-educated young man. And though many people may have scrambled into distinction without it, it is always with the greatest difficulty, just like climbing over a wall instead of giving your ticket at the door. This is a pretty stark warning about cultural gatekeeping in society, to use a 21st century phrase. But I'm not sure that it will have made much impression on a 15-year-old loath to do his construe. When you read this in conjunction with the earlier letter to Berwick, you wonder whether Scott believes that perhaps he himself has scrambled into distinction over the wall without being a perfect classical scholar, and whether this falls into the category of parental advice summed up as, don't do as I do, do as I say. 2 years later, however, Scott writes again to Charles with praise for his classical accomplishments, and he discloses a crucial truth about how and why classical texts, especially history, were read in this period. I am glad to find you are reading Tacitus with some relish. His style is rather quaint and enigmatical, which makes it difficult to the student. But then his pages are filled with such admirable apophthegms and maxims of political wisdom as infer the deepest knowledge of human nature. And it is particularly necessary that anyone who may have views as a public speaker should be the master of his works, as there is neither ancient nor modern who affords such a selection of admirable quotations. There's not really much piercing literary insight in these comments, but Scott is dispensing a typical view of why Tacitus is read and enjoyed by readers who persevere with his tricksy Silver Age Latin. Beyond the rather transactional idea that classical study was valued as a means of furnishing yourself with a catalogue of quotations to assist in public speaking, that's the Boris reason, or to ease your progress in society, there is real pedagogical and literary value in reading Tacitus. The 18th century belletrists, Adam Smith and Hugh Blair in particular, in each of their lectures on rhetoric, had admired Tacitus for his sentimental style. And that means both his focus on individual psychology, the individual psychology that dominated the imperial palace in Rome, and the pointed wisdom or incisive brilliance of Tacitus's succinct, declarative, sententious style. So that's what they liked in the 18th century. By 1822, this discourse of sentiment had been replaced by the discourse of human nature, the deepest knowledge of human nature. So when Scott says that Tacitus can infer the deepest knowledge of human nature, he refers to pithy comments such as this: flegitis manifestis subsidium ab audacia potendum, which translated means crime, once exposed, has no refuge but in audacity. This is the kind of sort of resounding condemnation that Tacitus brings out. And what he's doing there, where he says, crimes once exposed have no refuge but in audacity, is referring to the Empress Messalina's adultery. But the saying is a remark about human behavior and psychology in general. People are emboldened once their crimes are known and once they go unchecked. So by saying here that Tacitus infers, that by reading Tacitus, you can infer the deepest knowledge of human nature, Scott is hitting the sweet spot of what I want to call the classical aesthetic of literary culture in this moment in the 19th century. Classical texts were read and valued for the insight they bring to human nature and the sympathies that they evoke. And one of the things that's interesting about this moment is that one of the absolute best articulations of this comes of this sort of classical aesthetic of human nature comes from Keats, who is completely antithetical to whose classicism is so very different from this like vigorous sort of conservative human heart, human nature classicism that Scott and Blackwood's espouse. And it's when Keats says in his sonnet on reading Chapman's Homer that was when he first heard Homer speak out loud and bold. And that phrase, speak out loud and bold, that I think is what people want their classical literature to do in this period. And it sort of goes with what Scott says about his big bow wow strain of literature. That's just something I'd like you to bear in mind as I carry on. So, of course, Scott is aware that the opportunity for reading classical texts is mostly wasted on the young. He would most likely agree with Birlinn that the rigours of the schoolroom can more often thwart one's appreciation for the pleasure of texts as a reader. In Byron's note to a passage on Horace in Canto 4 of Childe Harold, Byron shows how texts tend to be muted by study and how too much schoolroom reading may foreclose certain pleasures forever. I wish to express that we became tired of the task before we can comprehend the beauty, that we learn by rote before we can get by heart, that the freshness is worn away, and the future pleasure and advantage deadened and destroyed by the didactic anticipation at an age when we can neither feel nor understand the power of compositions, which it requires an acquaintance with life, as well as Latin and Greek, to relish or reason upon. So, this is a good place to draw some threads together. What I'm talking about here is that, with Scott, is that even a writer's anti-classicism can be mixed and tempered. Scott's 2 letters to his son show, on one hand, the normative structures and strictures that made classics a bore, and on the other, they show the pleasure and value, the reward that such reading can bring. Given Scott's understanding of the value of classics, am I suggesting that he was being a bit radical for him in his resistance to them? Certainly, he pursued another path and showed others the way to studying Northern European literature, to being anti-classical. But at the same time, his life and writing was saturated with classical material. What I'd like to suggest is that classics was a manner for Scott, manners being a crucial term in his thinking about writing history that will become important presently. The classical tradition had handed down a legacy that was apparent in the following areas of Scott's life: Scott's law and its professional argot, general literary conventions, the habits of quotation and reference with which gentlemen talk to each other, antiquarian items, the artifacts of Roman Britain, disputes and controversies about these. These are all part of a great raft of classical detritus and classical remnants of the past that survive, mostly living, but not completely, in Scott's present in the 19th century. And Scott loved this kind of activity in particular. It's an antiquarian practice to sort through and sift this kind of detritus, to discover it for itself, and to assess its worth in relation to the present. Scott read the classics. He collected items from sites in Roman Scotland. There's a piece of the Antonine Wall in the Garden Wall at Abbotsford. He visited the Roman sites in Britain. He meditated a journey to Rome, taking it only at the very end of his life. And he also wrote his own classics in the Waverley novels. So by saying that Scott wrote his own classics, I mean two things. First, that the novels embody and depict the proliferation and range of Scott's engagement with classical texts and the classical tradition, and which they do more than any other department of his writing. So for all that the novel is seen as anti-classical, I think Scott is actually at his most classical in the Waverley novels, because the novel's broad scope as a genre, its realism, if you will, allows for the representation of the whole of life and society. And it's also classical in an authoritative kind of way, because the Waverley novels explicitly set out to write historiography, to represent people and society at different times. So, secondly, what I mean by Walter Scott writing the classics is that the Waverley novels were seen as classics of British literature unusually from the very moment that they were published. The reasons for this were various, but primary amongst them is that they represented human nature in the way that contemporary readers and critics, especially the critics, believed to have literary authority. And it was that authority that was rooted through the classical tradition. As eminent scholarship of the past 30 years has shown, Scott achieved literary legitimacy for both himself as a novelist and the novel as a genre by creating historical fiction that drew attention to the fact that it was history writing. Ironically, for Scott's disavowal of classicism, the novels derived much of their legitimacy from the conventional masculine erudition that they displayed. This was picked up from the very start. You can see how in this early review that clues to the identity of the anonymous author of Waverley were picked up from the very outset, and that Scott was unmasked for the British critic at least by the telltale signs of his profession and by his habit of quotation. The humorous and happy adaptation of legal terms show no moderate acquaintance with the arcana of the law, and a perpetual allusion to the English and Latin classics, no common share of scholarship and taste. Here, Scott's Latinity is his identifying feature. It's his trademark. But it is as the portraitist of human nature that Scott is heralded as preeminent. And this is the secret sauce of how the novels become both classics and sensationally popular in their own time. It's Scott's historical schema, the interplay between character and historical setting, that turns the novel into an authoritative technology for the examination of human nature. In fact, it's the definitional genre for human nature, if you will. In his well-known prefatory remarks to Waverley, Scott lays out his view that human nature is the subject of literature. So I'm going to start at the bottom, actually, of this paragraph, which comes from the first chapter to Waverley, because this is a great statement of what he's trying to do. It is from the great book of nature, the same through 1,000 editions, whether black letter or wile wove and hot pressed, that I have venturously essayed to read a chapter to the public. But while human nature is universal and constant, the same through 1,000 editions, human nature is always mediated for Scott by its times. People and characters behave a little differently in different eras because societies have different manners. Herein lies the interest of historical reading, whether it's reading text produced in other periods or reading historical fiction. It is the combination of nature and of manners, and the conjunction of the two to varying degrees, that makes the Waverley novels so successful. In the Waverley novels, you see universal characters overlaid with just the right amount of period detail to be convincing. Or rather, in the most successful Waverley novels, not necessarily in all of them. Scott describes this in many ways, but here are his first attempts. He says, what does he say? The particular manners and customs of an era may be denoted in the detail of dress. As Scott says, passions common to all men in stages of society. Passions are universal. They have, quote, alike agitated the human heart, whether it throbbed under the steel corselet of the 15th century, the boarded coat of the 18th, or the blue frock and white dimity waistcoat of present day. A time period's manners are a sort of filter for human nature, as the middle part of this segment shows. The state of manners and laws casts the necessary colouring, but the bearings, to use the language of heraldry, remain the same, though the tincture may be not only different, but opposed in strong contradistinction. The wrath of our ancestors, for example, was coloured gules, that's red. It broke forth in acts of open and sanguinary violence against the objects of its fury. Our malignant feelings, which must seek gratification through more indirect channels and undermine the obstacles which they cannot openly bear down, may be rather said to be tinctured sable, but the deep ruling impulse is the same in both cases. Scott's endeavour is to give each character, he writes, sufficient historical particularity and sufficient universality to be entertaining and instructive to the reader. His characters' affinity with their period is one of his key rubrics for the success of each novel. And this is why the novels that fall within the talismanic time frame of 60 years since are so successful for Scott. At the far horizon of living human memory, manners are just sufficiently familiar to be convincingly recalled, and they are just sufficiently different to be interesting. So, as a final example of how classics and historical fiction intersect, I want to look at one of Scott's most deliberately literary novels, and a favourite of many here tonight, Red Gauntlet. And here is its opening. Red Gauntlet begins with a quotation from Horace. Cur me ex animus querelis tuis, in plain English, why do you deafen me with your croaking? This is the beginning of Odes 2:17, a statement of Horace's bond of friendship with his patron Maecenas. It's actually, as was typical of Scott, a slight misquotation. Horace's line is, "Cur me querelis exanimis tuis," which actually scans differently, as well as being a more Latinate and less English word order. Scott uses Horace here to establish the friendship between Redgauntlet's joint heroes, Darcy Latimer and Alan Fairford. I hadn't noticed until I was looking at this again that actually the whole letter is kind of a rewriting of Horace Odes 2:17. I thought it was just a tag. So this is actually an unusual instance where Scott is really working through a classical text that he knows well. So what he's doing here, he's establishing the friendship between Redgauntlet's joint heroes. They've just parted ways on the road. Fairford is returning to law and his books in Edinburgh, while Latimer is pursuing his fancy in the wilds of the Solway. The letter is a performance of friendship and intimacy that conjures Alan's presence for Darcy and recreates the conviviality, a real Horatian conviviality, an evening of wine and talk. And it's recreated even in each other's absence through this letter. The tone is playful, a little bit more playful than the Horatian ode, which argues that Horace and Maecenas are two halves of a whole and inseparable by death. But throughout this letter, other ancient pairs of friends are referenced. Biblical David and Jonathan, Orestes and Pylades, Damon and Pythias. And their reference only to draw attention to the fact that Latimer and Fairford's situation as moderns mean that they have the advantage of being able to communicate by the technology of pen, paper, and post. This is a highly mannered opening gambit, and it's one that Scott chooses carefully to evoke the novel's setting in the late 18th century, namely in the summer of 1765, which is almost 60 years since his time of writing in 1823. So what he's depicting here are 18th century young men declaiming at each other in an Augustan manner. Classical banter is, in fact, one of the manners of this age. And, of course, this is in a letter, epistolary fiction, of course, is another one of the manners of the period in which Redgauntlet is set. Before he wrote Redgauntlet, Scott had been writing his life of Samuel Richardson, England's great epistolary novelist, author of Clarissa and Pamela, and he'd been doing that for Ballantyne's Novelists' Library. This essay was the opening piece in a collection that presented a run of 18th century British novels as a distinct and disproportionately masculine canon, given the number of novels that were written by women in the late 18th century, and specifically there's not a lot of Gothic in that collection. But it was published in 1824, which is the same year as this extremely literarily self-conscious novel by Scott. Scott's works were not included in the collection, but it presented Scott as the great arbiter of the genre and the Waverley novels as the apotheosis of the novel form. So another one of the manners of Redgauntlet is the form of the novel and its development. So I've talked a lot about classics as being associated with youth and learning here, but it was in the final year of his life that Scott eventually made his visit to Italy, travelling to Rome and Naples en route to Malta. This had been a long meditated trip. Once travel became possible again after the reopening of Europe in 1815, Scott planned a trip to Rome with his son Walter, writing in 1817 Methinks I will not quite die happy without having seen something of that Rome of which I have read so much. But that journey didn't come to pass. The one that did come was elegiac in nature. And Ian Gordon-Brown has written at length about Scott's travels in Europe. I'm just going to finish here by saying that while he was there, Scott was in failing health and he didn't muster much enthusiasm for what he saw. As Sir William Gell, who was his cicerone in Naples, as he writes, it was as if he had, Gell writes, it was as if he had wished he was in Scotland when he was at the site of the prophecy of Rome's greatness. And Gell said, I afterwards found that his only pleasure in seeing new places arose from the poetical ideas they aspired as applicable to other scenes with which his mind was more familiar. Scott's manners may have been classical, but his heart was always in Scotland. That's it.
Thank you very much indeed, Kristian, for a wonderfully wide-ranging talk. Now, as Kristian has indicated, she's keen to have any questions from the floor.
I will also say there are a lot of things that could have gone into this talk that didn't. I've got a little list, but some of them are probably, I'm sure, particularly appropriate for the room that we're in. I haven't hardly mentioned any Greek. I have not mentioned the foundation of the Edinburgh Academy, sorry. If anyone would like to talk about Jonathan Oldbach and the Came of Kinprunes, we can do that. So yeah, and please talk to each other as well. Yeah.
Is the Caledoniad on your list of topics that I'm not sure how to make this all the way a question.
Sure.
I'm interested in how the Caledoniad or Invasion Repelled, it literally is rewriting the classical epic in a northern vernacular, but
yes.
Fundamentally it can't come to fruition.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts?
So, the context of this is that in The Antiquary, the reluctant hero, the sort of wishy-washy hero, Lovell, is it's suggested by Oldbach that he writes a sort of oceanic epic, and there's this really wonderful conversation between the two of them. It's actually extremely funny dialogue where Lovell is uncertain and he says, I really don't want to do this, I don't think, and Oldbach says, it's funny because it's about nationalism and asserting Scottishness, but at the same time it's also, the dialogue goes, the invasion was not repelled, and Oldbach, who is the antiquarian, who's meant to be extremely precise and pedantic, says, it doesn't matter, you may defeat the Romans in spite of Tacitus. Mm-hmm. And I think the thing that's funny about that is that, it can't happen, and I guess my gloss on that is that Scott knows it's all over. Like, it is just a detritus of the past, and it's a sort of sterile kind of environment to try and do it in poetry. I think one of the things that's weird about that is that Scott himself was writing a lot of Scottish vernacular epics in poetry, and I do think that it's funny that there's just so much more classicism and like properly thought out historiography, ancient historiography in the novels than there is when Scott's writing in genres that come from the classical tradition itself. So I think he sees everything as like sort of merged and closed and put to bed. I guess that's a riff. Okay. Yes, Erin.
Just a wee question, I'll try to keep it brief as this. Since you managed to mention Byron twice,
Yes.
would you, and a half Scot as he was, would you say that you managed to stick to the genre of the novel and the historical novel, but the great vehicle of all the classicism, you would say, was actually being poetry? Robbie Burns just before him, and the young Byron was so saturated in the classics, so compellingly and enjoyably, Aberdeen, Harrow and all that. And his excellence was actually, when Scott was really, as we well know, hugely into his Marvin, his great narrative poems, would you say that Byron's excellence actually gave him Scott a punt? You keep your classical poetry, I'm getting on novels, because basically the poetry vehicle classical line had served its term in literary life. And it's just an idea that Byron actually gave Scott a good impetus to get on with what Scott could romantically do best.
Yeah, as in he let him off the hook. Yeah. I mean, I think that that's certainly true, and that Byron's classicism, is just so much more European and cosmopolitan, and he fits into this sort of second generation romantic field, this sort of segment. But Byron's a weird one. I mean, as I was saying about Keats, the position in Edinburgh is that Keats's poetry was artificial and effeminate and blah blah blah. That's Blackwood's and Lockhart. But Keats's appreciation of classics, wasn't just Endymion and Hyperion. And I think that Byron as a Philhellene, it often gets bracketed with Shelley and Keats, whereas in fact actually these characterizations are really quite narrow, and everyone was much more sort of plugged into a mainstream. It was so mainstream. And I think that's what I'm saying about Scott, that it was mainstream for him too, but he wasn't able, he didn't, I agree with you broadly that he wasn't under the pressure. I mean, I think when Byron says, I'm going to get this wrong, this is Byron, right? I'm going to swap my lakes for ocean, right? Is that Byron? Yeah. The ocean is the Mediterranean Sea and Europe and cosmopolitan culture, whereas Scott is probably with Wordsworth and Coleridge in lochs instead of lakes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking of Keats and his written urn.
Yes.
And then we just join them up.
Yeah. David, yeah.
Given Scott's interest in the classics for instruction for the next generation, did they say anything about Lockhart's obsession with the classics and his greater mastery of it? Anything admiring or?
I don't think Scott said anything to his own children about Lochart's classicism. I mean, I think, so the thing, I've also written about John Gibson Lockhart and his classicism, and Lockhart's Valerius, the novel, which is his first novel, which he publishes in 1820, particularly if you don't think that Peter's Letters to His King's Folk is a novel. It's a sort of typical audacious, precocious rather, thing to do. And he basically, what Lockhart does is, fresh from Oxford and his time in Balliol, and then coming back to Edinburgh to do his law degree, and then not being able to, well, he can't stay in Balliol, so he has to go to Oxford go back to Edinburgh to do his law degree. He is bored, and he decides to write a Waverley novel set in Trajan Rome. And I think this is a wonderful book, because it just takes all of these classical texts and translates them and puts them in a novel, and stitches it all together, but it falls completely flat as a novel for the general reader, or like this sort of adventure. And I think Scott could see it far enough. I don't think he enjoyed Lockhart's sort of towering displays of brilliance. I think he thought it was all directed towards the wrong ends, in the same way as Lockhart's satire. It was too much. I think actually it was kind of, I think that's what Scott thought.
Any final questions? There will be a chance to have a chat with Kristian later over refreshments.
Well, can I ask about the Edinburgh Academy then?
Yes.
As you said, because obviously we saw him writing to his kids saying, you should study hard and you'll get on better if you do. But I mean, there was this thing that the Academy would be a school that would properly do Latin and Greek like the English public schools. Did he reflect that the Royal High genuinely didn't give him what he needed? And do you think this was Scott's interest in the Academy something different and not really to do with the classics?
Well, I will answer based on what I know about Scott's interest in the Academy, but I'm sure there are other people in this room that really know the answer to that, so please pipe up if you do. My understanding is that that there was a controversy about the pronunciation of, I think it was Latin, not Greek, and that was it to do with church? It must have been to do with no. And that at the Royal High School, Latin, the boys were not pronouncing Latin properly.
That's right.
And so therefore a school on the north side of Edinburgh had to be founded. One of the things that is interesting in Peter's letters to his kinsfolk, which is John Gibson Lockhart's 1819 portrait of Edinburgh, basically seen through the eyes of a visiting Welshman. He talks about how the standard of classical learning at Edinburgh University is bad. And I mean, it's a very Oxford thing to say. But the typical line of thinking is that in Scotland you've got broad-based good parish school education, so everyone is highly literate, everyone is has a facility with Latin, definitely, and in England, this was Lockhart himself said this, I think, with the boot on one foot. He said, I got there and it was all ossified, that Oxford and Cambridge were closed institutions, not like the Scottish universities, which are so connected to each other and to cities and commerce and what have you. And this is in the 18th century. The 18th century Oxford was a sort of strange religious place. That the standard there was not high. But at the same time, when he comes to Edinburgh and he wants to slate Edinburgh University, he says that the standard of classics in the people who are coming to Edinburgh University is, lower than schoolboy Latin at an English public school. So it's extremely emotive. It's, people, I think it's one of these things, people always feel they've got a lot to say about it, but I don't think, partly because so many people, remember Latin lessons and that kind of thing, yeah. So.
Well, it's draw a line under things there. Thank you so much, Kristian. And I now would like to invite Dr. Ian Gordon-Brown to give the vote of thanks.
I've got so many notes based on your wonderful talk that I must try and sort them out somehow here. The richness and thoughtfulness of this presentation has, I think, ladies and gentlemen, been both fascinating and remarkable. And we owe Dr. Kerr a tremendous debt of gratitude, and we thank her very sincerely. 3 years ago, I spoke to the club on Scott, Greek, Greece, and the Greeks, being brave enough to call my lecture the Greek blockhead, and sufficiently confident in my audience's understanding that by opting to fix on this self-chosen epithet of his, I was in no way seeking to diminish Scott's intellectual standing. So it's been a particular pleasure, personal pleasure, for me tonight to have heard also about that other, essentially more important half of the classical pabulum of Scott's day, especially of Horace and Tacitus and Scott's Latinity, and indeed a mention of J.G. Lockhart's rather wonderful Valerius. It's always struck me that as significant that Scott was constantly remarking on the slenderness of his classical knowledge, and I think such repeated references surely indicated a sheepish regret that he was not more educated in the learned tongues. But as you've told us, he protested too much. He knew rather more than he let on. He brushed his comparative ignorance off by saying that he possessed the brain of a half-letter Goth. And you showed us that wonderful letter, which I had overlooked before, of how in his brain were thoughts not of a Roman patera, but of a witch's cauldron. Very much the same thing, the half-letter Goth again. The truth certainly was, I think, that he just didn't have a classical mindset. And when beginning to think in 1822 that he really ought to attempt some sort of European tour, he confessed to Lady Abercorn that he might well have to omit Rome. Rome! Truly the heart and essential component of the traditional grand tour. He didn't seem to think this odd, writing, "I am not very classical, and time will not serve me." Elsewhere he adapted to himself the line of Thomas Warton, a faithful truant, a faithless truant to the classic page. Insouciantly, he jested to Lockhart that my back is as broad and as hard as Ben Lomond's, and I treat as I please both the Greeks and the Romans. Now you stole one of the things that I really was going to say, and that was the advice to Charles, that it was much better to pay for your ticket rather than climbing over a wall by learning Greek and Latin. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I trust we've all paid for our tickets tonight rather than climbing up the front elevation of the new club, and that we don't regret our expenditure, having heard your elegant, erudite and instructive presentation. Of his half-hearted absorption of his classical lessons, his Latin lessons in high school, and his somewhat reluctant reading of the great writers of Roman antiquity, Scott delightfully said that for him it was like gathering grapes from thistles. In expressing our gratitude to you tonight, once more, I would remind you that the new club's wine, which we shall now enjoy together, is the traditional stuff made from grapes, and that there will not be a thistle cordial in sight. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Ian. Just before we sample the new club's wine, 2 items of club business to mention. The first is that our next meeting will be in February of next year. David, our club secretary, will be circulating in January the dates for next year's lectures and outings. And the second is that the topic for next year's colloquium is Scott's Journal. And if anyone is interested in taking part in that, again, please contact David, our club secretary. And now we're all invited to go upstairs, one level above this, to the Ramsay room, where new club wine and canapes will be served. Thank you all very much indeed for your attendance tonight.